Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. Thank you for joining us on such a rainy, crazy, busy Wednesday evening. I know there's a hockey game and a lot of traffic, so you all made it. Let's take a deep breath. Welcome to the Montalbano Family Theater at the Vancouver Public Library. My name's Jorge Amigo, and I'm the head of cultural programming here. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge we're hosting this event in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. I'm a settler from Mexico, which means I'm an immigrant from Mexico, which means I'm a settler in these lands. So I take a particular responsibility to program in a way that illuminates our collective understanding on the legacy of colonialism and its ongoing effects on the people and the land where we live and work. And on that note, it is my honor to introduce Tsleil-Waututh Elder Carleen Thomas, who will do a traditional welcome. And Carleen is an educator and a former council member of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation and is currently the chancellor of Emily Carr University and the first Indigenous person to serve as chancellor there. Welcome.
Thank you, Jorge. Osiem nit siaya I tanishkwaloen kutsi kutsnala ihui anta ansachalot anta mana santalia I kwatslahosiam anta imat kwatansachalot kwatslahosiam ikwat kwastematoch ikwat halat hi sepka amit sepwat wilam I chamathkuyam I skoholmish I stauta tamat. So what I said to you in the very teeny tiny bit of my language that I know called Hunkamitnam or Downriver Hulkamilam, I said, my respected friends, the feelings I have inside are really good. I'm really happy to see you and be with you here today. And in our cultural ways, I introduced myself to you with my ancestral name. I carry the name Ansrachalot. We are unaware that it has any meaning. We are unaware of its meaning. But it's very meaningful to me because my grandmother had to find that name. You know, back in the colonizing days, not only did they steal our languages, but they stole our names as well. And my grandparents had 11 grandchildren. And in the 70s, you know, it was kind of getting to be cool to be Indian, is what they called us. And our grandparents wanted us to have Huamoch names, ancestral names. So she had to research. And in her research, she found the name, Ansachalot, and she brought it to her. The matriarch of her family at the time was Emma Jo, or my great aunt. And she told her auntie she found the name and that it belonged to Auntie Emma. And Auntie Emma said, oh no, Mant means young one. It's your name. You found that name, you carry that name. So when my sister and I were deemed ready, I guess, to carry an Indian name, they placed Sitsiatma on my sister, Leah George Wilson, and Ansachalot on me. And in our cultural ways, I shared a little bit of my family tree with you. As you may be aware, in Huamoch country, in Indian country, we don't have a family tree, we have family forests. So my parents are Deanna George and the late hereditary chief Ernie, or Iggy as his friends called him. Both sets of my grandparents have passed on. My paternal grandparents were hereditary chief John L. George, and my granny was Lillian, or Dolly as her friends called her. For a real long time, I did not publicly acknowledge my mother's parents. And I guess as I was becoming closer to being a grandmother myself, it just caused me to pause and reflect. And what I realized was I was living in a very colonized way. You know, back in the day when they were building Canada, they took all the Indians and stuck us on reserves, drew borders around the reserves, stuck labels on the reserves. What they did was effectively divided us and set us against each other. We're then in competition for lands and resources. So in an effort to reconcile my own relationship with my sister nations of the Musqueam, the Squamish, it's with great honor and respect that I share with you that my mother's father comes from the Squamish Nation, and his name was Stanislas Joseph, or Stan. My grandmother comes from Nanaimo, from Nanaimo. Her mother is from Nanaimo. And Kinkoleth, her father is from a beautiful Nisgat village up in the Nass Valley. And raising my hands, and it's a gesture of welcome here in Coast Salish territory. Hi, Tsepka, thanking all of you. Amit Seputwilam, welcome you here to the homelands and waters of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. And I'd just like to thank Jorge and his team for inviting me here to provide this protocol, because back in the day, it would have been, you would have arrived here in canoes, and our leaders would have come down to the beach, our village would have come down to the beach, and we would have a spokesperson standing there asking you what your intentions were coming here. There would be a little bit of a dialogue, and then the chief would say, okay then, and then you'd be welcomed ashore. And then we would feed you. And then we would have a talk, we would sit and visit, do any kind of business we needed to have done, feed you again, and send you on your way. Or put you up for the night, whatever works. Anyway, it's a real great pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to this evening. Hait Sepka, thanking all of you.
Thank you so much, Carlene, for sharing all that and for starting us off in the right direction. Quick show of hands, who has been in this room before? A few of you, great. Who has been to a library event in the last year? Half of you, okay. Who's never been here? Okay, awesome. We need to up our marketing. So housekeeping notes for you. The bathrooms are located at the end of the hallway in this space, so that's the main exit that I want you to use. If in the event of an emergency, we can use both of these doors, but if you need to leave at any point, it's okay, you can come back, but just use that one, please. Take a moment right now to silence your cell phones. You're welcome to take it out and take a picture of the event or film for a few minutes or a few seconds if you need to, but please make sure that your phone's not making any noise. If you do take a picture, we would love it if you uploaded it to your social media and tagged the library. We love when you tell us that you were at a cool library event. Now, our friends from Massey Books are here tonight selling books, so let's give them a round of applause for being here. Wonderful bookstore located in Chinatown. If you've never been, please go visit them. And there's going to be a book signing at the end, so Marie's going to stand there or on the podium to sign books. Now, this is a very, very special night. As you all know, we get to hear from one of the 3 Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners, Marie Wilson, who will share her story and discuss her powerful memoir with us, North of Nowhere. And her friend, Professor Glenn Coulthard, will get up here in a moment to introduce her. But first, I want to tell you about the moderator. So, Marie will be in conversation with Andrea Crossan, who is a member of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation and is an award-winning radio journalist with over 30 years of experience. She has reported from over a dozen countries, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, Ukraine, South Africa, Uganda, Brazil. And she's currently the executive editor of the Global Reporting Center, which is an award-winning journalism center based out of the University of British Columbia. So if you don't know what that is, look it up. It's awesome. They do incredible work. So what's going to happen now is that Andrea and Marie are going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then they're going to open it up to questions from all of you. So start thinking about your very smart question. And I have a favor to ask you. Please stick to questions. We don't want to hear long, rambling comments. And also one tip, we actually did some extensive research at the library, and we found that there's no such thing as a 2-part question. We actually found that if you have a 2-part question, you actually have 2 questions. So please pick your favorite one and just ask that one. So now welcome to the stage Glenn Coulthard, who is an associate professor in First Nations and Indigenous Studies in the Department of Political Science at UBC, and he is the author of the award-winning book, Red Skin, White Masks. Glenn, join the stage.
Very tall. So thank you all for coming, for braving this bad weather, and then I forgot there was a Canucks game tonight, so also the Canucks traffic. My name is Glenn Coulthard. I teach political theory and Indigenous politics at the University of British Columbia. I was born in Yellowknife but raised in Norman Wells, and then eventually Kelowna, British Columbia. I'm Yellowknife's Dene. My mom, she is a residential school survivor. She went from 4, she was in the infirmary, and then until she graduated, so 16 or 17. It's my honor and privilege to introduce you to our esteemed guest this evening, Marie Wilson. Marie is a former journalist and public administrator who served as one of the 3 commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, or TRC. She holds a Bachelor in Arts degree in the French language and literature and a Master of Arts degree in journalism, both from the University of Western Ontario. While she was born and raised in Southern Ontario, she has spent most of her adult life living, working, and raising a wonderful family with her partner, Stephen, in Yellowknife, and some of whom are here today. Marie spent over 35 years working in journalism for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, including as regional director for CBC North, where she was also the founding host of the first weekly televised news program on and from the Northwest Territories, Focus North. During that time, she was brought on by the South African Broadcasting Corporation to support TV journalists as they prepared to cover the country's first democratic election and start up their own Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Her work has taken her all over the globe, including obviously here in Canada, but also France, South Africa, and parts of South America. Marie has received multiple awards in recognition for her career as a journalist, a teacher, a public administrator, and a lifelong advocate of human rights. To name only a few, she was appointed to the Order of Canada and to the Order of the Northwest Territories in 2017. In addition, she is the recipient of the Meritorious Service Cross, a Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, the CBC North Award for Lifetime Achievement, a Northerner of the Year Award, the Calgary Peace Prize, and she has received honorary doctorates from St. Thomas University, the Atlantic School of Theology, UBC School of Theology, the University of Manitoba, Western University, and the University of Alberta. In her book, which we are all here to celebrate and learn from this evening, North of Nowhere, Marie reflects on the TRC's crucially important work and her role within it, while also bearing witness to the testimonies of residential school survivors. So please join me in welcoming Marie Wilson in conversation with Tsleil-Waututh journalist and my colleague, Andrea Crossan. Thank you.
Not so tall. Thank you very much, Glenn, for that very fulsome introduction and warm words. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jorge, for the welcome to be here, and to our elder Colleen, not only for the very beautiful welcome to territory, but also the teachings that you embedded in your own introduction to place and welcome to place. It really meant a lot to all of us. I want to just add, following your example, and as an addendum to Glenn's introduction, that apart from my name, Marie Wilson, in this territory, I also carry the name Chakwa Sakwitlam, because I've been adopted into the Barney Williams family of the Nuu-chah-nulth peoples. And so I use that name with a great deal of honor, and not very often, actually, because I'm a little bit shy about it, but I know that it's a beautiful family to feel part of, and I have felt very much part of that family. Thank you all for coming. I want to acknowledge if there are any residential school survivors in the room. I don't know you all. I know there are a number of intergenerational survivors. Some of you have already self-identified that way, and I know there are others. So I really want to say a particular welcome to all of you. And I hope that you'll find that the book that I'm offering to the wider community over these many months here is a contribution to your own stories not being forgotten and indeed being better understood. I thought, and I'm looking forward to our conversation, Andy, thank you very much for agreeing to be my interviewer, as it were. But I think helpful, and especially because some of the young people are in the room, I want to acknowledge one person in particular, if I may, because you don't write a book. It's a lot of work to write a book. A few of you know that, and many of you probably don't know that. But I was able to do this work because I had tremendous support and help and guidance and encouragement from my amazing editor from the House of Anansi, and I want to acknowledge Shira Rose Walensky, who I see tucked away in the back rows there. I'm so happy that you're here, Shira Rose. This is our book. I think of it in that way. I want to just say a few words, though, especially for the younger ones or anyone who wasn't able, for whatever reason, to pay a lot of attention to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when it was happening, just to remind us a bit of those details. And then I would like to offer an excerpt of the book that is placed here right in this very city where you live. So we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, which was unique in the world. The first time ever in a so-called developed country. At the first time ever to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that came about not as a result of military conflict, but as a result of legal, social policy. Not as a result of something that happened over a short term, but something that happened over more than a century of duration, impacting multiple generations. And unique as well in that it directed its attention specifically on harms to children. And I think we often forget that because the people we hear talking about the residential schools as survivors are now fully adults, and many of them elderly, and far too many now gone altogether from our earthly relationships. But this was something that happened to children. And I don't want us ever to forget that. But it's also a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that is unique because in that way it is a David and Goliath story. It is the story of residential school survivors who, for the early parts of their lives, would not have had the right to vote, where that was not a right for Indigenous people in Canada until 1960, and who as adults started forming organizations and were able finally legally to gather in groups of more than 2 or 3, were able to move off of territories where they'd been assigned to live, were able to mount a court case, hire a lawyer, all those things that had been against the law, and were able to bring grievances against the government and the four national churches who ran residential schools on contract to the federal government, and brought court case saying what happened to us as children was not right, and there needs to be a reckoning. And so there was a massive court settlement, and it was out of court just because of the sheer numbers. Elder Corrin talked about how many were still alive at the time that they gathered. There were some 80,000 still alive at the time of settlement in every region of the country. And obviously that would have taken decades to work its way through the courts. And there wasn't time for that given the age of everyone and the capacity of courts at the best of times. And so there was agreement for an out-of-court settlement, and the point of this book and my involvement is that one of the critical make or break terms and conditions of that settlement was that there would be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because survivors wanted somewhere to put their side of the story on the record. And if they didn't have a day in court, there would be no such record. So it was a place for the children who were not keeping archives, who were not keeping written records of what was happening to them, to bring forward in oral testimony and oral statements to the commission their lived experiences. And we gathered some 7,000 statements. We were in every region of the country. We did our work unfolding over the course of 6.5 years, as it turned out, which was an extension from the original 5-year mandate. And so to this book, one of the things that is repeated often and throughout the book, but in all of our public statements, we three commissioners, is that reconciliation has implications for all of us. We are all expected to do our part. It is ongoing work. It wasn't a TRC piece of work. It's ongoing work, and it calls on specifically in our mandate the people of Canada. So that's all of us. And now we're all aging, and we're starting to forget what the TRC was about or why we had a TRC or who set it up. And no, it was not the government willingly. It was the government ordered by the courts to do that. We mustn't forget that. We mustn't forget who are the heroes of the story. And what I wanted to offer in this book was a documentation of the feeling I had so many times throughout the commission, which was, I wish everybody in Canada could be in this room right now. I wish everyone could hear what I just heard. I wish everyone could see what I just saw, what I just witnessed. And so this is my obviously abbreviated attempt to try to take readers, take Canadians on a retelling and a walking of the journey of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, following along the sequence of our national events, using those as milestone markers, and helping people understand, first of all, learn if they didn't know, remember if they've started to forget, and be reminded of the ongoing commitments that we've all made to living forward in respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. So perhaps that's enough by way of contextual. I wanted to read you an excerpt. So as I said, in part, and I don't want it to sound glib, but it's kind of a TRC travel log. You know, many people asked, what did you do and how did you do it? And so I really struggled with how to tell the story, but I ended up following along the 7 sacred teachings, which became the themes for our national events. And the one here in Vancouver was under the theme of honesty. And that's a little bit of what I would like to read for you. This happened in 2013. Vancouver was a standout in so many ways. The British Columbia TRC national event was our 6th and the only one in September. Survivors elsewhere had often described June as Freedom Day, when many, but not all, residential school children were able to go home for the summer. September, however, was the saddest month when children went to school. It was a month of collective physical and emotional rupture in Indigenous communities throughout the country, and no survivor gathered here would have forgotten that. And then, recalling your teaching, we started offshore. Thousands of people showed up to witness our formal arrival, the reenactment of an ancient welcoming ceremony. First, Murray and I joined a symbolic 5-kilometer paddle in a flotilla of massive, elaborately decorated dugout canoes. Upon arrival, we all raised our paddles to indicate non-aggression. Chair Sinclair stood up to shout across the waters the peaceful intentions of the commission. Only then were we welcomed ashore to do our work. The next day, the public also showed up in record numbers for the opening land-based activity. Despite the pouring rain, a day not unlike today, a huge crowd under a colorful canopy of umbrellas gathered for a massive reconciliation walk through the streets and over the bridges of downtown Vancouver. That reconciliation walk drew an estimated and unprecedented 70,000 people. But the BC setting also brought its particular realities and challenges. The greatest number of distinct Indigenous nations in Canada are in this province. This is the farthest reach from the eastern power centers of the government and churches that defined and shaped the Canadian residential school system. Yet at some point, the 4 major denominations that ran schools all operated in this province, 1 Catholic and 3 Protestant. Some of the most remote residential schools were located here, tucked away on one of the province's many isolated islands, out of sight for much supervision, out of mind for much accountability. Arguably, the most high profile of the many residential school lawsuits grew out of this province too. The Willie Blackwater case made it all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada and played a key role in turning the page on government and church denial of massive and long-lasting school harms and criminality. The downtown east side, the Highway of Tears, the Picton Farm, these are all residential school legacy stories. Survivors told the TRC of their connection to these places, of the experiences of family members or friends, those they knew who lived their lives in harm's way. Not all survived. Vancouver was a place of contradictions. Even with the multi-generational residential school legacy unfolding in plain sight, at our TRC national event, this also became the first place in the country to announce a year of reconciliation. Later, it declared itself a city of reconciliation. The province was home to the first government to create a formal department for reconciliation, the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, and later in 2019 became the first jurisdiction in North America to adopt the United Nations Declaration. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act was passed unanimously by the BC Legislative Assembly. Well, there's another piece that if time allows I might read, but I maybe just leave it at that and we'll engage in our...
Trust me, they are here to hear you, not me.
Yeah.
So please feel free to continue.
Well, there's one very particular thing, if you will allow then. Let me just say, British Columbia was also a homecoming for our TRC Bentwood box. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the beautiful bent cedar boxes that have such enormous spiritual and ceremonial importance and historical importance. And we had one that had been made for the TRC by one of your artists here, your Coastalish artists, Luke Marston. It's very beautiful. I won't take the time to describe it, and I wouldn't do it justice anyway, but it's magnificent. And all across the country, we traveled with that Bentwood box and used it in a ceremonial way to receive what we called expressions of reconciliation. And we received those from churches and governments and artists and all kinds of people. And I wanted just to read you this little bit about one exceptional gift to the Bentwood box. It was a rare collection of school records created by former students themselves decades earlier in the form of artwork. And I go on to explain the provenance of that and how that artwork came to be. But just to tell you a little bit about it, many paintings reflected childhood memories of life before residential school, village life, familiar birds, fishes, and whales. They spoke a silent language of remembering and deep longing. Others depicted the new realities of school days, including buildings above ground, burial sites beneath. I don't think any of us anticipated their emotional impact. I noticed how quiet we were, almost whispering, somber, reverent, as if we were at a wake. In such an unexpected format, these paintings spoke new evidence of what survivors had been telling us all across the country, that children died and were buried at Canadian residential schools, art documenting life. As diverse as they were, the paintings shared a common power. Throughout the TRC, we heard from adult survivors, often elderly, it was easy to lose sight of the fact that our commission was looking into harms and atrocities done to children. These paintings, clearly the work of young artists, also preserved a picture of survivors as children and what Canada had allowed to happen to them. And so I tell some other stories in that chapter, but just to leave you on a more of an upbeat light, and to tell you that in every chapter, despite hard contact, I've very intentionally tried to provide a lift at the end of every chapter, a lift at the end of every section, just as we did throughout the TRC to have a lift at the end of every day. And indeed, the book itself, I hope you'll experience it as being quite hopeful and very funny in parts as well, which you might find surprising. Never would I question or doubt the power of the arts, of commemoration, of ceremony, to breathe new life and transformation into the human realm. Nor would I lose hope. Just as loss and injury can leave visible and invisible scars, in the rebalancing of forces, I could see more clearly now how art and beauty can also leave enduring marks of light to stand out beyond darkness.
Oh, no, we're definitely on. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for making it out on this perfectly Vancouver evening that we have. It's an honor to be here. It's just a delight to have my colleague at UBC, Glenn, with us, and my cousin Carlene, who gave us the most beautiful, beautiful introduction and really setting the table for the conversation that we're here to have. And my sincere thank you to Dr. Marie Wilson for joining us this evening. I almost never get the opportunity to interview a journalist, so I know what I'm in for as well, that I better keep my questions short, sharp, and to the point.
And just the one at a time.
And just one at a time, a double-barreled question and a game over. I want to start off with talking a little bit about, because you just alluded to the fact that this is the journey of 6 years, and it was a journey that you were on, that you weren't on alone. And I want to talk a little bit about, if you want to share a little bit about the trio that you refer to as the judge, the jock, and the journalist.
Well, it's I say that with great affection for my two colleagues, and it's a perfect example of where I did try to build in a little bit of levity to the thing, but I go on at length to talk about their own background. They were both lawyers, one of them a judge, and the other, so I'm talking about Justice Murray Sinclair there, and Chief Wilton Littlechild did a lot of work as a lawyer internationally, continues to, on the UN Declaration itself. So I felt like I was in a really esteemed company, but I also thought we were a perfect balance as a trio. Some of you may remember, and it seems like a footnote at this point, but there were 3 commissioners named before us, and for a variety of reasons that we don't fully know, it didn't work. So they had to kind of restart the commission. And the relevance of that to your question, Andy, is that we made a very conscious decision that we were going to stick together off the top. It was really important that we cement our relationship. At our very first meeting, we made a pledge that we would not let survivors down, we would not bail, we would complete it. And we needed to do whatever it would take to get us to the finish. So part of that was we needed to build relationship with each other. I knew of the other 2, they knew of each other, they knew of me, but we didn't know each other, and none of us had ever worked together. And when you're doing work can test relationships at the best of times. When you're doing this kind of work, it contests a whole lot of things. And we also needed to be a built-in support system to each other, to be able to watch out for each other and protect each other and take care of each other along the way. So we made that, I think that's one of the smartest decisions we made, was that for the first 6 months we would do everything together. We went everywhere, we went across the country, we introduced ourselves as a trio and tried to build trust from survivors who were very angry by the time we started because they'd been waiting for so long. So I don't know what all else you would like me to add about that, except that after the first 6 months or so, just because of the magnitude of the work, we started having to spread out. So sometimes we would be in small subgroups of 2, and sometimes we were on our own. And so the things that I write about in my book, it's not our book, it's my book. I wasn't in all the same rooms as Willie and Murray, nor were they in all the same rooms as I was. So the notes are from my notes in the sessions where I was, and in some of the cases, as you'll see in the stories, they were also there. But we didn't have different experiences, we just had unique experiences.
And it seems like you also, in some ways, divided work based on need. So there were certain circumstances that you were specifically connecting with women who were survivors and having conversations that were sort of separate from your fellow commissioners to sort of help. How did that work?
Well, we didn't plan for it, I have to honestly say about that. We didn't plan for it because I don't think we properly, I mean, there was no roadmap to follow on this. As I said in my remarks, there had been no commission like this. And so we didn't really know what we were in for. We planned for a plan, and then we stayed flexible as it unfolded. And one of the things that we discovered is that for a number of survivors, women survivors particularly, some of them specifically wanted to talk to a female commissioner for their own reasons, but they just did not feel comfortable speaking to a man. The same may have been true in reverse. I don't know that because I wouldn't have been on the receiving end. But I know that there were some women who wanted to speak to a woman. So I realized the importance of that more clearly as time went on. But I also realized it more clearly as so many of the stories, and probably the most universal story that we heard was the shared experience of rupture from home. That was more common than anything else, that first day, that dramatic first day of being taken from home. And a lot of that was about detachment from mother. And so it became something that I got called upon as the woman. And in particular, I chose to discuss that issue, though it's not unique to Quebec, but something in particular happened in Quebec that made that a good place to explore that topic. And I go into it in some detail there, where I was specifically taken into a ceremony by the community women and entrusted with a particular responsibility towards the children. As they said, you are now the mother. I was essentially directed by these women to be the mother, looking out for and searching for and calling out for the missing children. Yeah.
In the context of your role, again, in the three of you, how important do you think it was, because you talk a little bit about this, about being sort of the north of 60, having representation from the north as part of this trio of commissioners?
Well, I think hugely important. I think the north is the least well-known part of the country. It's a great big expensive place to go, and most Canadians never make it there, truthfully, and yet had the highest per capita number of residential school students of anywhere in the country, because there's a majority Indigenous population in 2 out of 3 of the territories. And so the impacts were huge. It also had some of the very earliest residential schools and some of the latest. So one of the longest multi-generational runs of residential schools, especially in the Northwest Territories. The impacts are very recent, more recent in Nunavut, which was part of the Northwest Territories when it all began. But the schools in Nunavut, some of them were just opening up when they were closing down in the rest of the country. So the North had a very important story to share with the country about some of the longest experiences and the oldest and some of the most recent. And certainly the biggest distances of anywhere in the country in terms of how far children were taken from home and how inaccessible parents became. Sometimes children didn't go home for 8 or 10 years, ever. And sometimes children went home, and when they were sent home, the family no longer lived there. I mean, they were literally disconnected. So that was really important. And the other point, which you asked in your earlier question, I also am bilingual, and so it was really important that we have a solid storyline and input in Quebec. There were a number of residential schools there, and people needed, because the language that they ended up with was not English, it was French, and we needed to make sure that survivors there could also participate fully. And I also, as it turned out, did a lot of the smaller communities. I was very comfortable with that and happy. Justice Sinclair often was duking it out with levels of government or the courts trying to get the records we were supposed to have. And Chief Littlechild was often doing international advocacy. So we did split up. I did most of the ones on Vancouver Island and some of the interior BC. And anyway, it was, we tried to deploy our strengths and our familiarity. If we had connections in certain parts of the country, we zeroed in on those and assigned that way. Yeah.
Looking back to 2009, at the beginning, I can think about from a 2009 perspective. I don't know necessarily whether we were conversations around self-care were something that we were so cognitive of and thinking about, and obviously within the commission and within the testaments given by people over and over, day in, day out. What were the supports that were in place? You explained a little bit about the health service workers and how people were supported at the time who were coming forward, who were survivors and who wanted to talk about their experiences.
Well, as with so much of the book, really, the credit goes to the survivors, because in their negotiations for that out-of-court settlement, one of the things they negotiated for is that there will be culturally appropriate health supports for all survivors. And then what became clear as the commission started doing its work is that the health supports would be needed far beyond just the survivors. Yes, they would be the central demand, as it were, but people coming to bear witness, people like yourselves who may have come just to see what's going on here, people have hearts, they have beating hearts, and they react to what they're hearing and what they're experiencing. And we needed to make sure that we were taking care of people, and that, as our mandate specifically said, do no harm. But that was not our job to lay on the health supports. It was up to Health Canada. And what we needed to do is be very clear about what our plans were and give it as much advance notice as possible so that they could deal with the issue of capacity in the health supports. And I think it was, not only do I think it was really important, I think it was exemplary in Canada. And I've often felt, and I touch on it in the book, I wish that we had the vision to be able to see how those really incredibly well integrated health support teams, both Western trained and traditional knowledge keepers and cultural supports, how we might use those in other contexts. We know of circumstances, military is the obvious one, where people have PTSD and there are no supports available or not enough. And yet we have these incredible teams of people who've been working on the front lines of trauma now for a very long time. And we could think about that. If we could get over our blockades about what do Indigenous people have to contribute, we would be able to see that there's a whole lot more that could be deployed in the wider society. There's tremendous knowledge and expertise there.
I want to look at this also from a personal perspective, as somebody who was in the room and listening for hours and hours, days on days, weeks on weeks, years on years. And we talk about this from a journalistic lens. We would refer to it as secondary traumatic stress. The experience of stress that you have from hearing others talk of trauma and and the experience, the trauma that then is sort of the weight of that you carry. How did you manage this in your own life and your own experience? And I know that you talk about having a spiritual advisor in the book, to somebody to sort of lean on. But how did you manage this personally?
Well, I'll say two things. One, I'm still managing it. And number two, and not in any small measure, I wrote a book. It's a tremendous gift to yourself to dig deep enough that you can find the beauty in the ashes of all of that has gone on. And that's really what I'm trying to share here, that this is, we can turn away from things that are hard to look at, or we can say, no, let's look again, because what else is there? What do we learn from this? What do we do from this? And, you know, I could spend the whole night, Andy, telling you about, gee, it was hard, this was hard, that was hard, that was. I had really the easy job, and I always repeat that. It was a hard job, but it was an easy job. It was a privileged job. Because as I always said to survivors, all I had to do was listen to it. I didn't have to live it. And by the way, I was a grown-up. I wasn't a child. And yes, it was because I am a caring person, it was challenging. But you know, then the question becomes, how do you reorient your outrage so that it's doing something useful and productive, so that we are doing things in a better and different way going forward as a society. And that's what I'm provoking, I hope provoking us all to consider.
And though it also, there is connectivity and threads to residential survivors, to multi-generational trauma that is not at an arm's length. And that's one thing that you're very open about in the book, is the experience of your own family, your husband, your extended family, and the relationships to residential survivors that were very close to you.
Yeah. But you know, what I really hope in the book is that people will recognize themselves. And so when I don't want to be telling a survivor story. I want to be offering up, being in a way a conveyor of survivor stories based on their own words of what they told me and what I bore witness to. But what I can share is my story, and it will ring true for some people. So for example, one of the things I talk about, which is to your point, my husband being a residential school survivor, we were married for 15 years before I had any idea what had happened to him at residential school. And the value of that story is that it's absolutely not exceptional. Any survivor's family will be able to tell you that. I heard some reference to it just earlier this very evening. So that if people read that and they'll say, yeah, I understand that. That happened in our family too. That's how it was in our family too. People will recognize that and understand, I hope, in a better way. So that's why. So that's how come. So that's where this is coming from. And as one young intergenerational survivor said to us early on, it was in Calgary, I'll never forget it. He said, once I understood what had happened to my father, I was able to transform my anger into compassion. And he was able to build a whole new relationship with his parent, whom he loved, but whom he had an impossible relationship with because it was a relationship that was dominated by violence, which was how the parent had been raised. But the child, who's no longer a child but now an adult himself and now a parent himself, was able to talk to us and say, I raise my children differently, and I understand, and I'm able to forgive my father, and I have compassion for him. Those are transformative, miraculous moments in a family and in a community. And my thesis, my hopeful, naive thesis is in a country, that's possible if you can get it on a big enough scale, that you can transform how we deal with each other within a country and bring compassionate eyes and deeper understanding to the way we think about, talk to, and talk about each other.
As we are in this moment now, we are, approaching 10 years since since conclusion, since the report and the 94 calls to action. Why did you feel that this was the moment? Why were you in a space, in an intellectual and emotional space to write this book now?
Well, partly because it took me that long.
Honest, I appreciate.
Right after the commission, there was a lot of demand for us, for our time. Come here, speak here, teach there, present there, moderate here. I'm not complaining about any of that. I was so happily surprised because I was afraid that we would be like so many big projects where you do your work, you kill yourself trying to do it well, you hand in your report, and the dust starts to gather. And I was terrified that would happen. So every time there was an invitation, I promised myself that I would never say no. To the extent that I was able to move and breathe and get myself there, I would not say no to an invitation because I wanted to keep the momentum going. And I think for a bunch of reasons that are not just that, we have kept the momentum going. We're still talking about this 9 years later, which is a different way of answering your question. But I don't want us to stop 9 years in either. I want us to be able to keep talking about it. And what I've noticed is people start retelling the story in ways that are not entirely accurate. They're not entirely true. People start claiming credit for things that were not theirs to claim, like the government claiming that it set up a TRC, for example, as if that was its own good idea. And so we are aging. We 3 commissioners are aging. One of our beloved colleagues is unwell right now, and we're aware of that. I wanted there to be a first-hand account up close to say, this is the extraordinary thing that happened in Canada. These are the extraordinary people who came forward as national teachers to shake us all out of our ignorance and to wake us up. And this is the opportunity that we have to learn lessons from that history, which is our history. Canadian laws, Canadian policies. It's our opportunity to say, we're going to learn from that and try to do differently and do better. And so my book, it's not the be-all and end-all. It's one more tool that I hope will be available to contribute to never forgetting. But it is also, if I may say, I hope it will be experienced as a story that is well told and that is carefully written and that is accessible. So as a story that it stands on its own, but I also hope it will serve long life as an ongoing reference document, so that just as I've started to say recently, just as people have their favorite summer book that they like to read every summer, and I don't know why, a whole lot of women, it's Pride and Prejudice, I don't know why. But I would like to think maybe every September, North of Nowhere Song of Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner is a book one reads to remember, yes, this is that month. This is the month leading up to the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And what is that all about again? And when it comes to our Veterans and Remembrance Day, we have no problem recalling every year, retelling the stories every year, teaching our young people every year. And I want us to have the tools that we need to be able to do that going forward, so that when there are no more survivors left to speak for themselves, their words will have been recorded in, I hope, a very respectful way, so that they can continue speaking and telling their own story through the words of this book.
It gets to an interesting point in that we have the truth of the 7,000 people who shared, and the thousands and thousands more who were not able to, and as you reference also, the people that we lose every day who are survivors. Are you, in your perspective from then till now, when you look at the calls to action, how do you feel about progress?
Well, Well, I'm not a cut and dry kind of evaluator. You know, I think that we discourage ourselves if we say, oh, there's 94, but there's only 13. And it just takes the steam right out of everything. I know that everywhere I go in the country, I see amazing people doing their best to do great things. Is it enough? No, it's never enough. Is it fast enough? No, it's never fast enough. But is it way more than we were doing 10 years ago? Absolutely it is. You know, are we having this conversation tonight? Yes, we are. Have there been other Indigenous authors here sharing really important stories that could not have got published 10, 15 years ago? Absolutely. There are so many examples. I wish I could tell you them all. And once we have a national council for reconciliation, hopefully up and running, we'll have a mechanism for keeping track of good things that are happening. There's still enormous problems. I don't want to sugarcoat it at all. But I also don't want us to give up. I don't want us to give up. I want us to keep our promises that we have made, that we will keep working towards meaningful reconciliation in this country. And I hope the book will be inspirational in that way, not because I'm inspirational, but because there are many voices in this book, and they are inspirational. They're defiant, they're determined, they're brutal, but they are also poetic and funny and determined and completely inspirational. And I hope that, as I say, that will be one contribution. I hope a course that Glenn is teaching that probably wouldn't have existed 15 years ago at the university, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong on that, but universities, many of them, have now principles of reconciliation. Many have mandatory courses that must be completed as part of graduation. Where we live in the Northwest Territories, you can't graduate from high school, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, without having completed a course of study that includes learning about residential schools and treaty relationships. And there are examples in other parts of the country. I can't articulate all of them because I don't know all of them, but I know that I'm constantly running into people who are doing amazing things. And so I'm an optimistic person by nature, because I think the alternative is too depressing, and we don't need more reasons to depress ourselves in this world. We need to show how things can and should be, and we need to model that.
You write about how basically, you talk about how education is at the root of the problem of this, and education has to be the solution going forward. Throughout the book, you highlight specific stories of a number of people who shared their experiences, their residential school experiences, their survival experiences. And this is a completely unfair question, and I will set it up as such. It's a completely unreasonable question, but can you highlight a specific story of a specific experience of bearing witness that you can share? Because again, the book is filled with a lot of different experiences, but I want you to if you can share one.
Well, that's a completely unfair question.
It's a completely unfair question. I know.
As you said.
I'm the worst, but yeah, go ahead.
How are we for time? Are we close to time?
We're good. Okay, I'm getting 2 thumbs up, so we're okay.
No, because I'll tell you one story, but there's one thing, if I could find it quickly enough, that I would actually like to read, because I would like to leave you with some levity, because there is this levity in here too.
There is a lot. I can attest for the fact that there are laugh out loud moments and moments of absurdity, and at some point there is a fashion show involving all 3 commissioners that sounded quite amazing. So yes, you don't, the beauty of the book is also that you share all the aspects of what makes us fulsome human beings, which is we are not the sum of just the worst things that have ever happened to us. No one is, and the book is filled with moments of compassion and light and humor and love, which I know is a chapter that was a very difficult one in terms of the experience of focusing on love, but I turn it to you to say if there was somebody specifically that you could share about.
Well, I'll share a scenario, and I witnessed it more than once, but I'll I'll share this. Because I think it goes to a fundamental thing, that one of the travesties of what the residential schools did is it isolated children, not just from their homes, but from everything that they knew, including inability to even be in relationship with their own siblings, even if they were in the same space, sometimes in the same school. And yet that is such a core teaching, to be able to talk about your family lineage and even know who your family is and who you're related to. You know, that's an area of work that's part of the reclamation work that is going on. And we saw that point play out a number of times during the commission. So to answer your question, I remember one time in particular. It's not the most, so I don't want to put it in that category, but it's the whatever, but it's one example of a quite elderly survivor who was speaking to me, and the way we were set up, it was very intimate. So where Glenn is sitting there would be about as far away as we were, if not closer. So it was very close eye contact and quite intimate in that way. And everyone was in a circular way behind them, kind of as a sort of human blanketing, as I describe it in the book. And so the person speaking, the point is, couldn't see what all was going on behind them. And this particular person was saying, I have such a regret that I have never been able to tell my children how much I care about them, and I have not been a success as a good father. I've never been able to tell my child that I love them. And I wish they were here now, because I would like to tell them that I love them. And I am not making this up. At the back of the room, having just come through the door, is this young woman. I don't know her. She comes walking down the aisle, and she comes in and sits down in the seat beside her father and looks at her and looks at him, and and there's an exchange, which is, I love you, my girl, I love you, Dad. And that sort of spontaneous, miraculous moment, those moments would unfold, and you would think, all we had to do was create a space, stay quiet, be respectful, and wait for the miracles to start unfolding. You know, that's how it felt at times. And that would be one of those moments where I'd say, I wish everyone in Canada had witnessed that, you know. So that's one that's there were variations of that, I can tell you. So it wasn't a singular event.
Thank you. I think this seems like a naturally good spot to, though I have my million more questions, you are all here to share in this experience and the opportunity to ask Marie Wilson questions about her experience. I see hands already going up. And you can use the microphone, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to hear more about the themes, the different themes of the different places.
Okay. Yeah, so, you know, this is a teaching that's not common to all Indigenous nations in Canada, and I don't presume to be expert on this. So I'm just telling you where the context comes from. But one of the teachings among the Cree and among the Anishinaabe and some other Indigenous nations is the teaching of the 7 sacred teachings, or the 7 grandfather teachings. And when I tell you them, you're going to recognize them. They're very common to, honestly, most of the world's faith traditions, although not all faith traditions limit to 7. But they are values that you're going to recognize as ones that you've probably been taught in one context or another. But these are particularly 7. In our TRC mandate, it was particularly prescribed that we had to hold an unlimited number, unspecified number of community events. Didn't say what those were exactly or the nature of them, but we had to support community events. And we had to organize and hold 7 national events. That's what they were called, 7 national events. And it, again, didn't tell us how to do them, where to do them, what they were. It's just that they were not, the only the clue was they're national. So they're a big deal compared to community events. And so and I'm not going to go into all the detail of how we described or how we formulated what a national event would be. I do talk about it in the book. But then the question became, okay, 7, we got 13 jurisdictions in Canada. We have 10 members of a survivors advisory committee. How on earth are we going to duke this out where everybody feels like they got a piece of the TRC? And so the first was we used our survivors, you might say we copped out, but we used the survivors advisory committee and say, you tell us where we need to hold these 7 national events, but we gave parameters. We said if they're going to be national, they've got to be places where there's got to be infrastructure for a lot of people. There's got to be transportation hubs. There's got to be accommodation. And there's got to be a lot of media because we need that for our educational mandate to educate the people of Canada. So think about that. And in the end, anyway, that was the first thing. The second thing was, what will be the theme of these national events? And we decided there's 7. Let's go with the 7 sacred teachings. We will assign one of those to each of the national events. And again, we went back to the survivors and said, you tell us where you want the various themes to be. And I do write about that because it was a big deal. But what I will tell you in terms of the pathway, you'll see it's not like east to west or north-south. It was quite a wild shape. Our first national event was in Manitoba. It was in Winnipeg, and the theme was respect. The second national event, the theme was courage, and it was in Inuvik, and it was called the Northern National Event. The third national event was in the Maritimes. It was based in Halifax, and the theme was love. And that was the one that nobody wanted, by the way, because they said there was no love in those schools. So that was a really hard one to figure out where to hold that. And I do explore these themes in each of the sections of the book. And by the way it's formatted is there's a themed section, and then within each section there are 2 chapters, except for the north, which is where I live, and I had a lot more to say, and it allowed me to give context to my family and such. So it has 3 chapters. So that was courage, then love. Then from there we went to Saskatchewan. We were in Saskatoon for the theme of truth. From there we went back east. We were in Quebec, in Montreal for the theme of humility. And then we came here to BC for the theme of honesty. It was in Vancouver. We also did regional event in Victoria. And then we moved to Edmonton, which was our 7th national event, and the theme was wisdom. And then subsequent to that, we had both an opening and a closing event, and they were both in Ontario, in Ottawa, which is why we didn't have a national event in Ontario, because it had the opening and closing events. So that's how it played out. That's the journey you'll be on.
Hi. I am a Brazilian researcher.
Yes.
And actually, Brazil had a truth commission that finished in 2014, and they decided not to go through Indigenous people, more deep history, despite the fact that they had over 8,000 deaths, and the general death, the investigation was 800, so it was 10,000 more deaths for Indigenous people. So now we are reactivating another strategy for truth, memory, justice for Indigenous people in Brazil. The first meeting will be next week. So as a commissioner, I would like to listen from you, which would be your recommendations and learning from this commission for other countries that are beginning some kind of process that you think was important in terms of process, in terms of what we have to be aware of, or what would be lessons learned?
Yeah, so I'm familiar broadly with what happened in Brazil. I can't say what would be best for Brazil, but what I do believe was a critical factor for us, which is why I took the time at the beginning to tell you about the court case. I think it was really, really important that we were an independent commission. We were not politically mandated. And when we had trouble getting the government and the churches to do what they were supposed to do by the terms of the settlement agreement, We went back to court. We didn't go to the federal government and say, please, please, please. And we didn't go to the church and says, yeah, but we went back to court and said, we need you to give us directives, because when you tell us that they are supposed to give us all relevant documents, we actually thought that meant all relevant documents. Is that what the words mean? And they ruled in our favor, but we lost a year of time to that, which is partly why our commission went for 6.5 years instead of 5. And we spent a lot of money going back to court as well. So to the extent that it can be independent, that's really important. To the extent, and I don't know what my colleagues would say about this. I believe, as much as we're a great big country, as I often say, it's a great country, but it needs editing. You might say, well, all the more reason to have 20 commissioners instead of just 3 running all over the place. But I think there was a tremendous advantage in the intimacy of that. And there was an efficiency. Even though we were far apart, you didn't have to consult with 20 people, and you didn't have to broker everything down to the lowest common denominator. You could, one of the things that I talk about in the book, as it turned out, and I don't know whether those who selected us, because we weren't appointed, by the way. We weren't appointed, that's the other thing. We applied for the job. And there was a selection process. But it happened that one of us was a residential school survivor, one of us was an intergenerational survivor, and one of us was the spouse, a family member of a survivor. So that was a really good complementary team, because we brought different perspectives to it. So everyone had their own legitimate standing, as it were. And I think a lot of commissions fall apart because, honestly, I think they're too big. You can't get people together. You can't get people to agree on things. Or the government changes and you're hooped because the new government doesn't really want a commission. I think those things really helped us. It doesn't mean that I know how you can make that be the case in Brazil. But I think anything that can give standing to your commission to be independent is really valuable.
Time for one more.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. What kind of advice, Maria, would you give to young intergenerational survivors in their journey in reconciliation?
Well, I think one of the things that I hope is happening in all schools, and if it isn't, both for the parents and for the children, age appropriate, to ask their school if they're not learning what they need to be learning, to expect that they will be learning that. I think that's really, really important. I think for children to be taught respectful ways to ask the elders in their family the questions that they might have, so that they don't feel too shy to ask those questions, but to also be prepared that people may not be able to answer them. And so to be patient with timing, but I think for children to have tools to know how to ask those questions, and then to not give up, because sometimes I think young people are frustrated if they can't get the answers they need in their own family. And it may be that there's another family that they could ask, where they would be able to get help with getting the answers. And many survivors talk to us about their family of choice, because the family that they were born into wasn't available to them for whatever reason, but they found, aunties or grandparents or others who would take them in and help them and guide them, and who were more able, who were more ready. So that's the thing, and I think one of the things that I want to say to any intergenerational survivor is just be really proud of who you are, and do all that you can to invest in your own sense of belonging, because that's what the children were missing for so many generations, and to hold on to that and to seek that out and to really treasure it, and keep your heads just really high, and remember the teachings, to be humble about what you know. And I think one of the challenges is to fight anger, because there's a lot of good reason to be angry about a lot of things. and to try to live the values of kindness so that people can catch up to where they need to be. Yeah. Yeah, and don't try to figure it out by yourself. Find circles that you can, talk to others about it with. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
I think that is the perfect note for us to wrap up this evening. I will start by thanking Glenn Coulthard. Thank you so much for coming out this evening, our colleague, and for Carlene Thomas for joining us, for hosting us tonight at the Vancouver Public Library. We're really grateful for these events and these opportunities. My sincere thanks to Dr. Marie Wilson, North of Nowhere, Song of a Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner. It's a beautiful book, it's an important story, and it is one that you just will treasure because this is the history of our country, and this is the future. We must remember.